She fought to maintain her composure, but guilt was creeping onto her expression.
I did see that clip.
Was it bad? It was, I said quietly. Davy looked away and crossed her arms in front of her chest. I didn't know it was for Ambrose, she said. Some rich tosh came around, made a stunningly good offer. She looked back at me. Now that the chilly anger had left her, she looked surprisingly small. I'd never do business with Ambrose, she said, and I didn't know it was for you. I swear. You knew it was for someone, I said. There was a long moment of silence, broken only by the occasional crackling of the fire. Here's how I see it, I said. Recently, we've both done something rather foolish, something we regret. I pulled the robe more closely around my shoulders. And while these two things certainly don't cancel each other out, it does seem to me that they establish some sort of equilibrium. I held out my hands like they were the balancing plates on a scale. Davy gave me a small, embarrassed smile.
Oh, just him?
Perhaps I was hasty in demanding full repayment. I returned the smile and felt myself relax. How would you feel about sticking to the original terms of our loan? That seems fair. Davy held out her hand over the desk, and I shook it. The last of the tension in the room evaporated, and I felt a long-standing piece of worry unknot itself in my chest. Your hand is freezing, Davy said. Let's go sit by the fire. We relocated ourselves and sat quietly for several minutes. God's below, Davy said with an explosive sigh. I was so angry with you. She shook her head. I don't know if I've ever been that angry with anyone in my whole life.
You don't win that one, V.
I nodded. I didn't really believe you'd stoop to malfeasance, I said. I was so sure it couldn't be you, but everyone kept talking about how dangerous you were, telling stories. Then when you wouldn't let me see my blood, I trailed off, shrugging. Are you really still getting after echoes from the plumb bob? She asked. Little flashes, I said. And I seem to be losing my temper more easily, but that might just be the stress. Simmons says I probably have unbound principles in my system, whatever that means. Davy scowled. I'm working with less than ideal equipment here, she said, gesturing to a closed door. And I'm sorry, but the fellow offered me a full set of the Vautium Tegnaste. She waved to the bookshelves. Normally, I'd never make something like that, but unexpurgated copies are just impossible to find. I turned to look at her, surprised. You made it for him? It's better than handing over the formula, Davy said defensively. Part of me felt like I should be angry, but the majority of me was simply happy that I was warm and dry with no threat of death hanging over me. I shrugged it off. Simmons says you can't factor worth half a damn, I said conversationally. Davy looked down at her hands. I'm not proud of selling it, she admitted. Then after a moment, she looked up again, grinning. But the Tegnaste has gorgeous illustrations. I laughed. Show me. Hours later, my clothes were dry and the sleet had changed to gentle snow. Stonebridge would be a solid sheet of ice, but other than that, the walk home would be much more pleasant. When I emerged from the washroom, I saw Davy was sitting back at her desk. I made my way over and handed her the robe. I won't impugn your honor by asking why you own a robe much longer and broader in the shoulder than anything a delicate young lady of your size could ever wear. Davy snorted indelicately and rolled her eyes. I sat down and tugged on my boots. They were delightfully warm from sitting near the fire. Then I brought out my purse and lay 3 heavy silver talents on the desk, pushing them toward her. Davy looked at them curiously. I've recently come into a little money, I said. Not enough to settle my whole debt, but I can pay this term's interest early. I waved a hand at the coins. A gesture of good faith. Davy smiled and pushed the coins back across the table. You've still got 2 span before the end of the term, she said. Like I said, Let's stick to our original deal.
That's where everything gets.
I'd feel bad about taking your money early. Though I'd offered Davy the money as an honest peace offering, I was glad to keep my 3 talents for now. There is a vast difference between having some coin and no coin. There is a feeling of helplessness that comes from having an empty purse. It's like seed grain. At the end of a long winter, if you have some grain left, you can use it for seed. You have control over your life. You can use that grain and make plans for the future. But if you have no grain for seed in the spring, you are helpless. No amount of hard work or good intention will make crops grow if you don't have the seed to start with. So I bought clothes, 3 shirts, a new pair of pants, and thick woolen socks. I bought a hat and gloves and scarf to keep away the winter's chill. For Ari, I bought a pouch of sea salt, a sack of dried peas, 2 jars of peach preserves, and a pair of warm slippers. I bought a set of lute strings, ink, and a half-dozen sheets of paper. I also bought a sturdy brass drop bar and screwed it to the window frame in my tiny garret room. I could circumvent it fairly easily, but it would keep my few possessions safe from even the most well-intentioned thieves. Chapter 43. Without Word or Warning. I stared out the front window of Anchors, looking at the falling snow and idly turning Denna's ring over in my fingers. Winter lay heavy over the university, and Denna had been gone for more than a month. I had 3 hours before class with Elodin, and I was trying to decide if the slim chance of finding Denna was worth the long, cold walk to Imre. As I stood at the window, a Sealdish man came through the door, stomping the powdery snow from his boots and looking around curiously. It was still early in the day, and I was the only person in the common room. He walked over to me, snowflakes melting in his beard until they were bright beads of water. "Sorry to bother you. I'm looking for a fellow," he said, surprising me with his utter lack of anything resembling a Sealdish accent. He reached inside his long coat and pulled out a thick envelope with a blood-red seal. "Kavothi," he read slowly, then turned the envelope toward me so I could see the front. "Kvothe, Anchors Inn, University, 2 miles west of Imre. Bellany Baron, Central Commonwealth." It was Denna's handwriting. "It's Kvothe, actually," I said absent-mindedly. "The E is silent." He shrugged. "You him?" "I am," I said. He nodded, satisfied. "Well, I got this down in Tarbean about a span back. Bought it off of a fellow for a hard penny. He said he bought it off of a sailor in Junpui for a vintage silver bit. He couldn't remember the name of the town where the sailor had got it from, but it was inland a ways." The man met my eye. "I'm telling you this so you don't think I'm trying to shim you on the deal. I paid a full hard penny, then came over myself from Imre, though it was out of my way." He looked around the common room. "Though I'm guessing a fellow with a fine inn such as this won't quibble about giving a fellow his due." I laughed. "This isn't my inn," I said. "I just have a room here." "Oh," he said, obviously a little disappointed. "You looked kinda proprietorial standing there. Still, I'm sure you see I need to make my money off this." "I do," I said. "How much do you think is fair?" He looked me up and down, eyeing my clothes. "I suppose I'd be happy making my hard penny back and a soft penny besides." I brought out my purse and fished around in it. Luckily, I'd been playing cards a few nights before and had some Aturan currency. "Seems fair," I said as I handed over the money. He started to go, then turned back. "Out of curiosity," he asked, "would you have paid 2 hard pennies to get it?" "Probably," I admitted. "Kissed." He swore, then headed back outside, the door banging behind him. The envelope was heavy parchment, wrinkled and smudged with much handling. The seal showed a stag rampant standing before a barrel and a harp. I pressed it hard between my fingers, shattering it as I sat down. The letter read, "Kvothe, I'm sorry to leave Imre without word or warning, I sent you a message the night of my departure,
that
but
mean?
I expect you never received it. I have gone abroad
for
looking
linear?
for
I
greener
don't for linear.
pasture and
I'm
better
fantastic.
opportunity. I am
A lot of
fond of
people do
Imre
for
and
linear.
enjoy the pleasure of your occasional, though sporadic, company. But it is an expensive city in which to live, and my prospects have grown slender of late.
Not like it.
Yale is
can be
lovely,
slow
all
sometimes.
rolling hills. I find the weather quite to my liking. It is warmer, and the air smells of the sea.
Just like your
It seems
AES.
I might pass an entire winter without being brought to bed by my lungs, my first in years. I have spent some time in the small kingdoms, and saw a skirmish between two bands of mounted men. Such a crashing and screaming of horses you have never heard.
You're gonna feel it.
I have spent some time afloat as well, and learned all manner of sailors' knots and how to spit properly.
Brooks?
Also, my cussing has been greatly broadened. If you ask politely when we next meet, I may demonstrate my newfound skills. I have seen my first Adem mercenary.
Really?
They call them bloodshirts here. She is hardly bigger than me, with quite the most remarkable gray eyes. She is pretty but strange and quiet, endlessly
It's a
twitching.
hard push. But
I have not seen her fight, and I am not sure I wish to, though I am curious. I am still enamored of the harp, and I am currently housing with a skilled gentleman, whom I shall not name,
amazing.
for the furtherance of my study in this. I have drunk some wine while
Wait,
writing
why
this
not?
letter. I mention this to excuse my above spelling of the word furtherance. Furtherance.
I
Kissed.
almost killed the Valk.
You know what I mean.
1 HP.
I apologize for not writing sooner, but I have been a great deal traveling, and not until now have I had means to write a letter. Now that I have done, I expect it might be a while longer before I find a traveler I
Love it,
trust to
Eddie.
start this missive on its long road back to you. I think of you often and fondly. Yours, D. Postscript.
Hit him 50.
I hope your loot case is serving you well.
They're running.
Yeah, they're fucking deep.
Elodin's class began
Never
strangely
enough, right?
that day.
Yeah,
For one, Elodin was actually on time. This caught us unprepared, as the 6 remaining students had taken to spending the first 20 or 30 minutes of the class gossiping, playing cards, and griping about how little we were learning.
Dude,
We
that
didn't
was
even
fucking
notice Master
terrifying.
Namer until he was halfway down the steps of the lecture hall, clapping his hands to get our attention.
Oh, wait, this guy just really tried to
The
run
second odd thing was that Elodin was dressed in his formal robes. I'd seen him wear them before when occasion demanded, but always grudgingly. Even during admissions interviews, they were usually rumpled and unkempt. Today, he wore them as if he meant it. They looked sharp and freshly laundered. His hair wasn't in its normal state of dishevel
Played
either.
that so
It
bad,
looked
but
like it
so
had been
well.
trimmed
That was
and
so
combed.
weird.
Reaching the front of the lecture hall, he climbed onto the dais and moved to stand behind the lectern. This, more than anything, made everyone sit up and take notice. Elodin never used the lectern.
Are you not
Long
dead?
ago, he said without any preamble, this was a place where people came to learn secret things. Men and women came to the university to study the shape of the
It was
world.
like an M&K thing.
Elodin looked out
Where
at
you,
us.
like, move your mouse.
In this
hella
ancient
fast,
university,
and, like,
there was no skill more sought after than naming. All else was base metal.
It's a lot
Namers
harder than
walked
people
these streets
think.
like tiny gods. They did terrible,
You can, like,
wonderful
perfect
things,
it as fucking
and
perfect.
all others envied them. Only through skill in naming did students move through the ranks. An alchemist without any skill in naming was regarded as a sad thing, no more respected than a cook.
It's a
Sympathy
lazy-
was invented here, but a sympathist
it's
without
lazy.
any naming might as well be a carriage driver. An artificer with no names behind his work was little more than a cobbler
Doing
or a
it, it's
smith.
so hard.
They all came to learn the
Whoa.
names of things,
I have no idea
Elodin
what
said, his dark eyes intense,
Yeah, bro,
his
that's
voice
fucking
resonant
hard. I
and
cannot
stirring.
vibrate
But
like
naming
that.
cannot
This
be
guy
taught
right
by
now,
rule or rote.
He just went in the...
Teaching someone to be a namer is like teaching someone to fall in love. It is hopeless. It cannot be done.
He's on my
Master
left.
Namer smiled a
he's
bit
on
then,
my left.
for the first time looking like his familiar self. Still, students tried to learn, and teachers tried to teach, and sometimes they succeeded. Elodin pointed. Fella! He motioned for her to approach. Come. Fella stood, looking nervous as she climbed up to join him on the lecturer's dais. You have all chosen the name you hope to learn. Ilodin said, his eyes sweeping over us. "And you have all pursued your studies with varying degrees of dedication and success." I fought the urge to look away shamefacedly, knowing that my efforts had been half-hearted at best.
Chipotle meals from the tournament.
"Where you have failed,
Use them, though.
Fela has succeeded," Ilodin said.
Like 5 free.
"She has found the name of Stone."
5 free fucking.
He turned sideways to look at her. "How many times?" 8 times, she said, looking down, her hands twisting nervously in front of her.
Like a
There was a murmur of genuine awe from all of us.
Chipotle.
She had never mentioned this in our frequent griping sessions. Ilodin nodded, as if approving of our reaction. "When naming was still taught, we namers wore our prowess proudly. A student who gained mastery over a name would wear a ring as declaration of their skill." Ilodin stretched out a hand in front of Fela and opened it, revealing a river stone, smooth and dark. "And this is what Fela will do now, as proof of her ability." Startled, Fela looked at Ilodin. Her eyes flickered back and forth between him and the stone, her face growing stricken and pale. Ilodin gave her a reassuring smile. "Come now," he said gently. "You know in your secret heart you are capable of this. And
I
more."
was excited for my team too. It was me, Cap.
Fela bit her lips and took hold of the stone. It seemed bigger in her hands than it had in his. She closed her eyes for a moment and drew a long, deep breath. She let it out slowly, lifted the stone, and opened her eyes so it was the first thing she would see. Fela stared at the stone, and there was a long moment's silence. The tension in the room built until it was tight as a harp string. The air vibrated with it. A long minute passed. 2 long minutes. 3 terribly long minutes.
I'm so fucking dead.
Ilodin sighed gustily, breaking the tension. "No, no, no," he said, snapping his fingers near her face to get her attention. He pressed a hand over her eyes like a blindfold.
I was fucking in there.
"You're looking at it.
Oh, that's not good.
Don't look at it. Look at it." He pulled his hand away.
If you can hold, trust me.
Fela lifted the stone and opened her eyes.
Come here.
At the same moment, Ilodin gave her a sharp slap on the back of the head with the flat of his hand. She turned to him, her expression outraged, but Ilodin merely pointed at the stone she still held in her hand. "Look!" he said excitedly.
We're good.
Fela's eyes went to the stone, and she smiled as if seeing an old friend. She covered it with a hand and brought it close to her mouth. Her lips moved. There was a sudden sharp cracking sound, as if a speck of water had been dropped into a pan of hot grease. There followed dozens more, so sharp and quick they sounded like an old man popping his knuckles, or a storm of hailstones hitting a hard slate roof. Fela opened her hand and a scattering of sand and gravel spilled out. With 2 fingers, she reached into the jumble of loose stone and pulled out a ring of sheer black stone. It was round as a cup and smooth as polished glass. Ilodin laughed in triumph before sweeping Fela into an enthusiastic hug. Fela threw her arms around him wildly in return. They took several quick steps together that were half stagger, half dance. Still grinning, Ilodin held out his hand. Fela gave him the ring, and he looked it over carefully before nodding. "Fela," he said seriously, "I hereby promote you to the rank of Relar." He held up the ring. "Your hand."
If you're good with it.
Almost shyly, Fela held out her hand, but Ilodin shook his head. "Left hand," he said firmly. "The right means something else entirely. None of you are anywhere near ready for that." Fela held out her other hand, and Ilodin slid the ring of stone easily onto her finger.
Yeah, I have 600.
The rest of the class broke into applause, rushing close to get a look at what she had done. Fela gave a radiant smile and held out her hand for all of us to see. The ring wasn't smooth as I'd first thought. It was covered in 1,000 tiny flat facets. They circled each other in a subtle swirling pattern, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Chapter 44. The Catch.
Just a little bit of light there.
Despite the trouble with Ambrose, my obsession with the archives, and my countless fruitless trips to Imre hunting Denna, I managed to finish my project in the fishery.
Dude, that guy is fucking...
I would have liked another span of days to run a few more tests and tinker with it, but I was simply out of time. The admissions lottery was coming up soon, and my tuition would be due not long after. Before I could put my project up for sale, I needed Kilvin to approve my design. So it was with no small amount of trepidation that I knocked on the door of Kilvin's office. The master artificer was hunched over his personal work table, carefully removing the screws from the bronze casing of a compression pump. He didn't look up as he spoke. "Yes, Relar Kvolf." "I'm finished, Master Kilvin," I said simply. He looked up at me, blinking. "Are you now?" "Yes. I was hoping to make an appointment so I might demonstrate it to you." Kilvin set the screws in a tray and brushed his hands together. "For this, I am available now." I nodded and led the way through the busy workshop, past stocks, to the private workroom Kilvin had assigned me. I brought out the key and unlocked the heavy timber door.
That's fucking dead.
It was large as workrooms go, with its own fire well, anvil, fume hood, drench, and other assorted staples of the artificing trade.
Dead.
I'd pushed the work table aside to leave half of the room empty except for several thick bales of straw stacked against the wall. Hanging from the ceiling in front of the bales was a crude scarecrow. I dressed it in my burned shirt and a pair of sackcloth pants. Part of me wished I'd run a few more tests in the time it had taken to sew the pants and stuff the straw man.
I'm just dead.
But at the end of the day, I am a trooper first and all else second. As such, I couldn't ignore the chance for a little showmanship. I closed the door behind us while Kilvin looked around the room curiously. Deciding to let my work speak for itself, I brought out the crossbow and handed it to him. The huge master's expression went dark.
Yep.
"Relar Kvolf," he said, his voice heavy with disapproval. "Tell me you have not squandered the labor of your hands on the improvement of such a beastly thing." "Trust me, Master Kilvin," I said, holding it out to him.
Thanks, Jaybird.
He gave me a long look, then took the crossbow and began to examine it with the meticulous care of a man who spent every day working with deadly equipment. He fingered the tightly woven string and eyed the curved metal arm of the bow.
You're on him and you just
After
can't
several
get off
long
him.
minutes, he nodded, put one foot through the stirrup, and cocked it without any noticeable effort. Idly, I wondered how strong Kilvin was. My shoulders ached, and my hands were blistered from struggling with the unwieldy thing over the last several days. I handed him the heavy bolt, and he examined it as well. I could see him looking increasingly perplexed. I knew why. The bow didn't have any obvious modifications or sigildry. Neither did the bolt.
Not having to aim, like, at all.
Kilvin slotted the bolt into the crossbow and raised an eyebrow at me. I made an expansive gesture to the straw man, trying to look more confident than I felt.
Hell is sticky.
My hands were sweating, and my stomach was full of doves.
The reason why I
Tests
didn't
were
stick
fine
with
and
those
good.
is, like,
Tests were
medium
important.
range, if I was using
Tests
a
were
1x,
like
I feel
rehearsal.
like
But
really
all
had
that
to, like,
really matters is what happens when the
control
audience
every
is
roll
watching.
hard.
This is a truth all troopers know. Kilvin
It's not
shrugged
bad, it was just
and
that, like, I
raised
had
the
to hold
crossbow.
down so hard, like, I just wasn't used to
It looked small braced against his broad shoulder, and he took a moment to carefully sight along the top of it. I was surprised to see him calmly draw half a breath, then exhale slowly as he pulled the trigger.
Dude, it's been bad.
The crossbow jerked, the string twanged, the bolt blurred.
Not this time.
There was a harsh metallic clank, and the bolt stopped midair
Right on
as if it had
KC
struck
for,
an
like,
invisible wall. It clattered to the stone floor in the middle of the room, 15 feet away from the straw man. Unable to help myself, I laughed and threw my arms triumphantly into the air. Kilvin raised his eyebrows and looked at me.
What's up, casual?
I grinned a manic grin. The master retrieved the bolt from the floor and examined it again. Then he recocked the crossbow, sighted, and pulled the trigger. Clank! The bolt dropped to the floor a second time, skittering slightly to one side.
Every start of the split, but
This time, Kilvin spotted the source of the noise. Hanging from the ceiling in the far corner of the room was a metal object the size of a large lantern. It was rocking back and forth and spinning slightly, as if someone had just struck it a glancing blow. I took it off its hook and brought it back to where Master Kilvin waited at the work table. "What is this thing, Relark Wolf?" he said curiously. I set it down on the table with a heavy clunk.
140.
In general terms, Master Kilvin, it's an automatically triggered kinetic opposition device.
The Valk.
I beamed proudly. More specifically, it stops arrows. Kilvin bent to look at it, but there was nothing to see except for featureless plates of dark iron. My creation looked like nothing so much as a large eight-sided lantern made entirely of metal. "And what do you call it?" That was the one part of my invention I hadn't managed to finish. I'd thought of 100 names, but none of them seemed to fit. Aerotrap was pedestrian. The Traveler's Friend was prosaic. Bandit Bane was ridiculously melodramatic. I could never have looked Kilvin in the eye again if I'd tried to call it that.
Why?
"I'm having some trouble with the name," I admitted.
Yeah, man, you're not supposed to be throwing
"But
shots
for
at
now
the
I'm
bro.
calling it an arrow catch."
He's racing. He's getting that bread.
Kilvin grunted. "It does not catch the arrow, precisely."
Bread.
"I know," I said, exasperated. "But it was either that or call it a clank." Kilvin looked at me sideways, his eyes smiling a little. "One would think a student of Illodan's would prove more facile with his naming, Relark Wolf." "Delavari had it easy, Master Kilvin," I said. "He just made a better axle and stuck his name on it.
What I've learned.
I can't very well call this the Kvothe."
Is that
Kilvin chuckled.
I used to like land 50
True.
and then wait till I get like a.
He turned back to the arrow catch, eyeing it curiously.
But I
"How
kept
does it
dying whenever,
work?"
Like my teammates would die, so at some point
I grinned and brought out a
if I can't
large
beat
roll
20,
of
bro, I'll
paper
just start
covered in
spraying
diagrams,
people.
complicated sigildry, metallurgical symbols, and painstaking formulae for kinetic conversion.
Or like a charge rifle, you just
"There are two main parts," I said. "The
I started
first
winning my
is the sigildry that automatically forms a sympathetic link with any thin, fast-moving piece of metal within 20 feet.
Why'd you cancel your?
I don't mind telling you, that took me a long couple of days to figure out.
Or why'd you like not want to go? To
I tapped the appropriate runes on the piece of paper.
I mean, I'm probably gonna
At first,
go to, like, the
I thought
actual
that
Twitch
might be
console,
enough
but-
by itself. I hoped if I bound an incoming arrowhead to a stationary
all
piece
the
of iron, it would absorb
Twitch
the
consoles,
arrow's
they
momentum
didn't
and
seem
make it
to
harmless.
interest Me, I'm not gonna lie.
Kilvin shook his head.
It looked pretty bad.
"It has been tried before." "I should have realized before I even tried," I said. "At best, it only absorbs a third of the arrow's momentum, and anyone 2/3 arrow shot is still going to be in a bad way." I gestured to a different diagram. What I really needed was something that could push back against the arrow, and it had to push very fast and very hard. I ended up using the spring steel from a bear trap, modified, of course. I picked up a spare arrowhead from the work table and pretended it was moving toward the arrow catch.
Fought here for the entire
First, the arrow comes close and establishes the binding. Second, the incoming arrow's momentum sets off the trigger, just like stepping on a trap.
full team coming labs.
I
too.
snapped my fingers sharply. Then the spring's stored energy pushes back at the
I'll
arrow,
loot up
stopping it or even knocking it backward. Kilvin was nodding along. "If it needs to be reset after each use, how did it stop my second bolt?"
I'm here.
I pointed to the central diagram. "This
Give me
wouldn't be of
400,
much
I am
use
for
if it only stopped one arrow," I said. "Or if it only stopped arrows coming from one direction. I designed it to have 8 springs in a circle. It should be able to stop arrows from several directions at once." I shrugged apologetically. "In theory. I haven't been able to test that."
Get on my roof.
I'm trying to help you.
Kilvin looked back at the straw man.
I'm just get on my roof.
"Both of my shots came from the same direction," he said.
What do you get on my
"How was the second one stopped if that spring had already been triggered?" I picked up the arrow catch by the ring I'd set into the top and showed how it could rotate freely.
I cracked somebody else.
"It hangs on a pivot ring," I said. The shock of the first arrow set it spinning slightly, which brought a new spring into alignment.
stairs, Ed?
Even if it hadn't, the energy of the incoming arrow tends to swing it around to the nearest untriggered spring, like a weather vane points into the wind. I hadn't actually planned the last. It had been a lucky accident, but I didn't see any reason to tell Kilvin that.
Is probably one of the worst.
I
guns in
touched
game
the
unless
red
you get,
dots
like, hit by
visible
rain.
on 2 of the 8 iron faces of the arrow catch. These show which springs have been triggered. Kilvin took it from me and turned it in his hands. "How do you reset the springs?"
Our capacitor isn't pulling up yet.
I slid a metal device out from under the work table, little more than a piece of iron with a long lever attached. Then, I showed Kilvin the 8-sided hole in the bottom of the arrow catch. I fit the arrow catch onto the device and pressed down on the lever with my foot until I heard a sharp click. Then I rotated the arrow catch and repeated the process.
I have 4 bullets.
Kilvin bent to pick it up and turned it over in his huge hands. "Heavy," he commented. "It needed to be sturdy," I said. "A crossbow bolt can punch through a 2-inch oak plank." I needed the spring to snap back with at least 3 times that much force to stop the arrow. Kilvin shook the arrow catch idly, holding it to the side of his head. It didn't make any noise. "And what if the arrowheads are not made of metal?" he asked. "These Sambi raiders are said to use arrows of flint or obsidian." I looked down at my hands and sighed. "Well," I said slowly, "if the arrowheads aren't some sort of iron, the arrow catch wouldn't trigger when they came within 20 feet. Kilvin gave a non-committal grunt and set the arrow catch back down on the table with a thump. "But," I said brightly, "when it came within 15 feet, any piece of sharp stone or glass would trigger a different set of bindings." I tapped my schema. I was proud of it, as I'd also had the foresight to inscribe the inset pieces of obsidian with the sigildry for twice tough glass. That way, they wouldn't shatter under the impact. Kilvin glanced at the schema, then grinned proudly and chuckled deep in his chest. "Good, good. What if the arrow has a head of bone or ivory?" "The runes for bone aren't trusted to a lowly relar like myself," I said.
Oh, shit.
"And if they were?" Kilvin asked. "Then I still wouldn't use them," I said, lest some child doing a cartwheel trigger the arrow catch with a thin, quickly moving piece of their skull. Kilvin nodded his approval. "I was thinking of a galloping horse," he said. "But you show your wisdom in this.
That fast, dude.
You show you have the careful mind of an artificer." I turned back to the schema and pointed. "That said, Master Kilvin, at 10 feet, a fast-moving cylindrical piece of wood will trigger the arrow catch." I sighed. "It's not a good link, but it's enough to stop the arrow, or at least deflect it." Kilvin bent to examine the schema more closely, his eyes wandering the crowded page for a long couple of minutes. "All iron?" he asked. "Closer to steel, Master Kilvin. I worried iron would be too brittle in the long term."
There's 5. And they each have 7.
"And each of these 18 bindings are inscribed on each of the springs?" he asked,
You
gesturing.
can punch it.
Punch it twice.
I nodded.
Punch a section twice.
"That is a great duplication of effort," Kilvin said, his tone more conversational than accusatory.
Fucking broken.
"Some might say such a thing is overbuilt." "I care very little what other people think, Master Kilvin," I said. "Only what you think." He grunted, then looked up from the paper and turned to face me. "I have 4 questions." I nodded expectantly. "First, of all things, why make this?" he asked. "No one should ever die from ambush on the road," I said firmly. Kilvin waited, but I had nothing more to say on the matter. After a moment, he shrugged and gestured to the other side of the room. "Second, where did you get the—" His brow furrowed slightly.
What?
"Tevetbem, the flat bow." My stomach clenched at the question.
A lot of people aren't.
I'd held the vain hope that Kilvin, being Sealdish, wouldn't know such things were illegal here in the Commonwealth. Barring that, I'd hoped he simply wouldn't ask. I procured it, Master Kilvin, I said evasively. I needed it to test the arrow catch. "Why not use a simple hunter's bow?" Kilvin said sternly, "and thereby avoid the need of illegal procurement?" "It would be too weak, Master Kilvin. I needed to be sure my design would stop any arrow, and a crossbow fires a bolt harder than any other." "A Modegan longbow is equal of a flat bow," Kilvin said. "But the use of one is beyond my skill," I said, "and the purchase of a Modegan bow is far beyond my means." Kilvin let out a deep sigh. "Before, when you made your thief's lamp, you made a bad thing in a good way. That I do not like. He looked down at the schema. This time you have made a good thing in a bad way. That is better, but not entirely. Best is to make a good thing in a good way. Agreed? I nodded.
On me.
He lay one massive hand on the
no, I took off my
crossbow.
gun. That's not you.
Did anyone see you with it? I shook my head. Then we will say it is mine, and you procured it under my advisement. It will join the equipment in stocks. He gave me a hard look. And in the future, you will come to me if you need such things. That stung a bit, as I'd been planning on selling it back to Sleet. Still,
Pretty in shambles.
it could have been worse. The last
I
thing
don't
I
worry.
wanted was to run afoul of the iron law. Third, I see no mention of gold wire or silver in your schema, he said. Nor can I imagine any use they could be put to in such a device as yours. Explain why you have checked these materials out of stocks. I was suddenly pointedly aware of the cool metal of my gram against the inside of my arm. Its inlay was gold, but I could hardly tell him that. I was short on money, Master Kilvin, and I needed materials I couldn't get in stocks. Such as your flatbow. I nodded. And the straw, and the bear traps. Wrong follows wrong, Kilvin said disapprovingly. The stocks are not a money-lender's stall and should not be used as such. I am rescinding your precious metals authorization. I bowed my head,
Dude, this
hoping
is
I
so
looked
stupid.
appropriately chastised.
Outside.
You will also work 20 hours in stocks as your punishment. If anyone asks, you will tell them what you did, and explain that as a punishment you are forced to repay the value of the metals, plus an additional 20%. If you use stocks as a money lender, you will be charged interest like a money lender. I winced at that. Yes, Master Kilvin. Last, Kilvin said, turning to lay one huge hand on the arrow catch. What do you imagine such a thing would sell for, Relar Kvothe? My heart rose in my chest. Does that mean you approve it for sale, Master Kilvin? The great bear-like artificer gave me a puzzled look. Of course I approve it, Relar Kvothe. It is a wondrous thing. It is an improvement to the world. Every time a person sees such a thing, they will see how artificery is used to keep men safe. They will think well of all artificers for the making of such a thing.
Oh.
He looked down at the arrow catch, frowning thoughtfully. But if we are going to sell it, it must have a price. What do you suggest? I'd been wondering on this question for 6 span. The simple truth was, I hoped it would bring me enough money to pay for my tuition and my interest on Davy's loan, enough to keep me in the university for one more term. I honestly don't know, Master Kilvin, I said. How much would you pay to avoid having a long yard of ash arrow shot through your lung?
Short-term memory.
He chuckled. My lung is quite valuable, he said. But let us think in other terms. Materials come to... He glanced at the schema. Roughly 9 jots. Am I correct? Uncannily correct. I nodded. How many hours did it take you to make? About 100, I said. Maybe 120. But a lot of that was experimentation and testing. I could probably make another in 50 or 60 hours. Less if moldings are made. Kilvin nodded. I suggest 25 talents. Does that seem reasonable to you? The sum took my breath away. Even after I repaid stocks for materials and the workshop took its 40% commission, it was 6 times more than I'd earn working on deck lamps. An almost ridiculous amount of money. I began to agree enthusiastically. Then a thought occurred to me. Though it pained me, I slowly shook my head. Honestly, Master Kilvin,
Dude, if I had
I'd prefer to
heals,
sell them more cheaply than
we
that.
should have just swung inside again.
He raised an eyebrow. They will pay it, he reassured me. I have seen people pay more for less useful things. I shrugged.
After I killed that guy,
25 talents is a lot of money, I said.
We actually win that.
Safety and peace of mind shouldn't only be available to those with heavy purses.
I didn't.
I think 8 would be a great plenty.
Like outside. You can go here.
Kilvin looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. as you say, 8 talents. He ran his hand over the top of the arrow catch, almost petting
weren't
it.
getting pred any.
However, as this is the first and only one in existence, I will pay you 25 for it. It will go in my personal collection.
Yeah, fuck, I do.
He cocked his head at me. Linsatva? Lin,
Yeah, alright.
I said gratefully, feeling a great weight of anxiety lifting
last
off
game?
my shoulders. Kilvin smiled and nodded toward the table. I would also like to examine this schema at my leisure. Would you like to make me a copy?
First cap.
For 25 talents, I said, smiling as I slid the paper across the table. You can have the original. Kilvin wrote me a receipt and left, clutching the arrow catch like a child with a new favorite toy.
Sniple?
I hurried to Stocks with my slip of paper. I had to settle my debt for materials, including the gold wire and silver ingots.
White armor.
But even after the workshop took its commission, I was left with almost 11 talents. I went through the remainder of the day grinning and whistling like an idiot. It is as they say, a heavy purse makes for a light heart.
Yo, I'm not gonna lie, that just scared the fuck out of me.
Bandus is fucking dead.
Chapter 45, Consortation. I sat on the hearth at Anchors with my lute in my lap. The room was warm and quiet, full of people who had come to hear me play. Felling was my regular night at Anchors, and it was always busy. Even in the worst weather, there weren't enough chairs, and those who came late were forced to cluster around the bar and lean against walls. Lately, Anchor had needed to bring in an extra girl on Felling night just to hurry drinks around the room. Outside the inn, winter was still clutching at the university, but inside the air was warm and sweet with the smell of beer and bread and broth. Over the months, I had slowly trained my audience to be properly attentive while I played, so the room was hushed as I fingered my way through the second verse of Violet Bide. I was in fine form that night. My audience had bought me half a dozen drinks, and in a fit of generosity, a tipsy scriv had tossed a hard penny into my loot case, where it lay shining among the dull iron and copper. I'd made Simon cry twice, and Anchor's new serving girl was smiling and blushing at me with such frequency that even I couldn't miss the signal. She had beautiful eyes. For the first time I could remember, I actually felt like I had some control over my life. There was money in my purse, my studies were going well, I had access to the archives, and despite the fact that I was forced to work in Stocks, everyone knew Kilvin was terribly pleased with me. The only thing missing was Denna. I looked down at my hands as I entered into the final chorus of Violet Bide. I'd had a few more drinks than I was used to, and I didn't want to fumble. As I watched my fingers, I heard the door of the tap room open and felt a chill wind curl around the room. The fire swayed and danced beside me as I heard boots moving across the wooden floor. The room was quiet as I sang. She sits by her window, she sips at her tea. She waits for her love to return from the sea. Her suitors come calling, she watches the tides, and all the while, Violet bides. I hit the final chord, but instead of the thunderous applause I expected, there was only an echoing quiet. I looked up and saw 4 tall men standing in front of the hearth. The shoulders of their heavy cloaks were wet with melted snow. Their faces were grim. 3 of them wore the dark round caps that marked them as constables. And if that weren't clue enough as to their business, each of them carried a long oak cudgel bound in iron. They watched me like hard-eyed hawks. The 4th man stood aside from the others. He didn't wear a constable's cap and wasn't nearly so tall or broad across the shoulders. Despite that, he carried himself with undeniable authority. His face was lean and grim as he drew out a piece of heavy parchment decorated with several black official-looking seals. "Quoth Aladdin's son," he read aloud to the room, his voice clear and strong. "In the sight of these witnesses, I bind you to stand to your own account before the iron law. You are charged with consortation with demonic powers, malicious use of unnatural arts, unprovoked assault, and malfeasance.
This guy.
Needless to say, I was caught completely flat-footed.
Dude.
What? I said
He's not
stupidly.
playing the same game.
As I said, I'd had more than a few drinks.
There's buddies here, but
The grim man ignored me and turned to one of the constables. Bind him!
where they at?
One of the constables drew out a length of clattering iron chain. Up until now, I'd been too startled to be properly afraid, but the sight of this grim-faced man pulling a pair of dark iron manacles out of a sack filled me with a fear that turned my bones to water.
Up here, full new team.
Simon appeared next to the hearth, pushing his way past the constables to stand in front of the fourth man.
Wait, this guy right here.
"What exactly is going on here?" Sim demanded, his voice hard and angry.
I'm having an absolute.
It was the only time I'd ever heard him sound like the son of a duke. "Explain yourself!"
I killed the Valk.
The man holding the parchment eyed Simon calmly, then reached inside his cloak and brought out a stout iron rod with a band of gold around each end. Sim paled a bit as the grim man held it up for everyone in the room to see. Not only was it every bit as threatening as the constable's cudgels, the rod was an unmistakable symbol of his authority.
Where?
The man was a sumner for the Commonwealth courts.
I have nothing on scan.
Not just a regular sumner either.
I mean, like,
The gold bands meant he could order anyone to stand before the iron law. Priests, government officials, even members of the nobility up to the rank of baron.
You're 100%.
At this point, Anchor made his way through the crowd as well. He and Sim looked over the sumner's document and found it to be very legitimate and official.
there's two.
It was signed and sealed by all manner of important people in Imre.
I'm a fucking idiot.
There was nothing to be done. I was going to be brought up against the iron law.
My keyboard into my head.
Everyone at Anchor's watched as I was bound hand and foot in chains. Some of them looked shocked, some confused, but most of them simply looked frightened. When the constables dragged me through the crowd toward the door, barely a handful of my audience were willing to meet my eye. They marched me the long way back to Imre, over Stonebridge and down the flat expanse of the great stone road. All the way the winter wind chilled the iron around my hands and feet until it burned and bit and froze my skin.
I think that's what I meant.
The next morning, Sim arrived with
Apparently,
Alxadal, and matters slowly
new
became
map.
clear. It had been months since I had called the name of the wind in Imre after Ambrose broke my lute. The masters had brought me up on charges of malfeasance and had me publicly whipped at the university. It had been so long ago that the lash marks on my back were nothing more than pale silver scars. I had thought the matter resolved. Apparently not. Since the incident had occurred in Imre, it fell under the jurisdiction of the Commonwealth courts.
I got it.
We live in a civilized age, and few places are more civilized than the university and its immediate environs. But parts of the iron law are left over from darker times. It had been 100 years since anyone had been burned for consortation or unnatural arts, but the laws were still there. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. Ambrose wasn't directly involved, of course. He was much too clever for that. This sort of trial was bad for the university's reputation. If Ambrose had brought this case against me, it would have infuriated the masters. They worked hard to protect the good name of the university in general, and of the Arcanum in particular. So Ambrose was in no way connected with the charges. Instead, the case was brought before Imre's courts by a handful of Imre's influential nobles. Oh, certainly they knew Ambrose, but that wasn't incriminating. Ambrose knew everyone with power, blood, or money on either side of the river, after all. Thus was I brought up against the iron law. For the space of 6 days, it was a source of extraordinary irritation and anxiety to me. It disrupted my studies, brought my work in the fishery to a standstill, and drove the final nail into the coffin I used to bury my hopes of ever finding a local patron. What started as a terrifying experience quickly became a tedious process filled with pomp and ritual. More than 40 letters of testimony were read aloud, confirmed, and copied into the official records. There were days filled with nothing but long speeches, quotations from the iron law, points of procedure, formal modes of address,
How long?
Old men reading out of old
I low-key
books.
still struggle with control.
I defended myself to the best of my ability,
I still
first
struggle with
in the
this sometimes.
Commonwealth Court,
I'm not perfect.
then in church courts as well.
But it
Arwell
didn't
and
take long
Elxa
to,
Dahl
like, get to
spoke
the
on
point
my
where I'm
behalf, or rather,
Yeah.
they wrote letters, then read them aloud to the court. In the end, I was
Really
cleared of
want
any
to
wrongdoing.
looky.
I thought I was vindicated. I thought I had won,
I already have an
but I was still terribly naive in many ways.
Dude, we actually finally made it.
Chapter
in.
46, Interlude,
Feel different,
a bit
okay.
of fiddle.
Fuck.
Kvothe came slowly to his feet and gave a quick stretch. "Let's pause there for now," he said.
Right where we left off.
"I expect we'll see more than the usual number of people for lunch today.
Not really, but
I need to check on the soup and get a few things ready." He nodded to
I mean, it
Chronicler.
might be.
"You might want to do the same." Chronicler remained seated. "Wait a minute," he said. "This was your trial in Imre." He looked down at the page, dismayed. "That's it?" "That's it," Kvothe said. "Not much to it, really." "But that's the first story I ever heard about you when I came to the university," Chronicler protested. "How you learned Tema in a day. How you spoke your entire defense in verse, and they applauded afterward. How you—" "A lot of nonsense, I expect," Kvothe said dismissively as he walked back to the bar. "You've got the bones of it." Chronicler looked down at the page. "You seem to be giving it pretty short shrift.
Something in the back.
If you're
one of the back
desperate for the
panels
full
just-
account, you can find it elsewhere," Kvothe said. "Dozens of people saw the trial. There are already 2 full written accounts. I see no need to add a third." Chronicler was taken aback. "You've already spoken to a historian about this?"
I'm only down to one more
Kvothe
replacement.
chuckled deep in his
This
throat.
controller and one more
"You sound like a jilted lover." He began to bring out stacks of bowls and plates from beneath the bar. "Rest assured, you're the first to get my story."
Might be able to get this one like.
"You said there were written
$30
accounts,"
last warranty.
Chronicler said. Then his eyes widened. "Are you telling me you've written a memoir?" There was a strange note in the scribe's voice, something
yawning?
almost like hunger. Kvothe
You
frowned.
want to talk about breaking something? What'd you break?
"No, not really."
Me too.
He gave a gusty sigh. "I started something of the sort, but I gave it up as a bad idea."
Tremendous. You spent 4 of those.
"You
hours
wrote all the
watching
way to your
the
trial in Imre,"
Yeah.
Chronicler said, looking at the paper in front of him. Only then did he realize he was still holding his pen poised above the page. He began to unscrew and clean the brass nib of the pen on a cloth with an air of vast irritation. "If you already had all this written down, you could have saved me cramping my hand for the last day and a half."
I broke in. Oh wait, no, I broke.
Kvothe's
I
forehead
broke in a
creased
phone.
in confusion.
That's true. I did
What?
break that one phone. That one
Chronicler
time I
rubbed
dropped
the
it, I
nib
broke it.
briskly with a cloth, every motion screaming with affronted dignity. "I should have known," he said.
Oh.
"It all fit together
You
too
just got a bad taste
smoothly."
in film.
He glared up. "Do you know how much this
How many-
paper
how many,
cost me?"
Like buttons did you put on the back of your
He
bag?
made an angry gesture to the satchel that held the finished pages.
A 0?
Kvothe simply stared at him for a moment, then laughed
Oh,
with
dude, I
sudden
still
understanding.
use a paddle.
"You misunderstand. I gave up the memoir after a day or so. I wrote a handful of pages, not even that."
Super easy. to
The
get used
irritation faded from Chronicler's face, leaving a sheepish expression. "Oh.
to. Yeah, I play hold.
You are like a wounded lover," Kvothe said, amused. "Good Lord, calm yourself. My story is virginal.
Nah, it's
Yours
cool.
are the
I don't
first
like- I don't
hands
like
to
that
touch it."
stretch. I,
He shook his
like,
head.
Mainly, I pressed my X and Y.
There's
button when I
something
clock.
different
Not
about
really-
writing a story down. I don't seem to have the knack for it.
Yeah.
It came out all wrong. "I'd love to see what you wrote,"
I actually like.
Chronicler
I actually
said,
jump.
leaning forward in
It's a
his
bad
chair.
habit, but I still jump.
"Even if it's just a few pages."
I gotta get used to like.
It was quite a while ago, Kvothe said. "I don't know if I
Where
remember
is
where the
everybody?
pages are."
What?
"They're up in your
happened to
room,
me?
Reshi," Bast said brightly.
Okay.
"On your desk." Kvothe gave a deep sigh. "I was trying to be gracious, Bast. The truth is, there's nothing on them worth showing to anyone. If I'd written anything worth reading, I would have kept writing it." He walked into the kitchen, and there were muted, bustling sounds from the back room.
I know you just got beamed.
"Good try," Bast said softly. "But it's a lost cause. I've tried." "Don't coach me," Chronicler said testily. "I know how to get a story out of a person." There was more bumping from the back room, a splash of water, the sound of a door closing. Chronicler looked at Bast.
Team on height.
Shouldn't you go help him? Bast shrugged, lounging further back into his chair. After a moment, Kvothe emerged from the back room carrying a cutting board and a bowl full of freshly scrubbed vegetables. I'm afraid I'm still confused, Chronicler said. How can there already be 2 written accounts if you never wrote it yourself or talked to a historian? Never been brought to trial, have you? Kvothe said, amused. The Commonwealth courts keep painstaking records, and the Church is even more obsessive. If you have a desperate desire for the details, you can dig around in their deposition ledgers and act books, respectively.
I killed one. The guy
That might be the case, Chronicler said, but your account of the trial would be tedious, Kvothe said. He finished paring the carrots and began to cut them. Endless formal speeches and readings from the Book of the Path. It was tedious to live through, and it would be tedious to repeat. He brushed the sliced carrots from the board into a nearby bowl.
The other team is fighting.
I've probably kept us at the university too long anyway, he said. We'll need the time for other things. Things no one has ever seen or heard. Reshi, no! Bast shouted in alarm, sitting bolt upright in his chair. His expression was plaintive as he pointed to the bar. Beets? Kvothe looked down at the dark red root on the cutting board, as if surprised to see it there. Don't put beets in the soup, Reshi, Bast said. They're foul! A lot of people like beets, Bast, Kvothe said. And they're healthful. Good for the blood. I hate beets, Bast said piteously. Well, Kvothe said calmly, since I'm finishing the soup, I get to pick what goes into it. Bast came to his feet and stomped toward the bar. I'll take care of it then, he said impatiently, making a shooing motion. You go get some sausage and one of those veiny cheeses. He pushed Kvothe toward the basement steps before storming into the kitchen, muttering. Soon there was the sound of rattling and thumping from the back room. Kvothe looked at Chronicler and gave a wide, lazy smile. People began to trickle into the Waystone Inn. They came in 2s and 3s, smelling of sweat and horses and freshly mown wheat. They laughed and talked and tracked chaff across the clean wooden floors. Chronicler did a brisk business. Folks sat leaning forward in their chairs, sometimes gesturing with their hands, sometimes speaking with slow deliberation. The scribe's face was impassive as his pen scratched across the page, occasionally darting back for ink.
I've been playing controller.
Bast and the man who called himself Coat worked together as a comfortable team. They served up soup and bread, apples, cheese and sausage, beer and ale and cool water from the pump out back. There was roasted mutton, too, for those who wanted it, and fresh apple pie. Men and women smiled and relaxed, glad to be off their feet and sitting in the shade. The room was full of the gentle buzz of conversation as folk gossiped with neighbors they had known their whole lives. Familiar insults, soft and harmless as butter, were traded back and forth, and friends had comfortable arguments about whose turn it was to buy the beer. But underneath it all, there was a tension in the room. A stranger would never have noticed it, but it was there, dark and silent as an undertow. No one spoke of taxes or armies, or how they had begun to lock their doors at night. No one spoke of what had happened in the inn the night before. No one eyed the stretch of well-scrubbed wooden floor that didn't show a trace of blood. Instead, there were jokes and stories. A young wife kissed her husband, drawing whistles and hoots from the rest of the room. Old man Benton tried to lift up the hem of the Widow Creel's skirt with his cane, cackling when she swatted him. A pair of little girls chased each other around the tables, shrieking and laughing while everyone watched and smiled fond smiles. It helped a bit. It was all that you could do. The inn's door banged open. Old Cobb, Graham, and Jake trudged in out of the brilliant midday sunlight. "Hello, Coat!" Old Cobb called, looking around at the handful of people spread around the inn. "You've got a bit of a crowd in here today." "You missed the bigger part of it," Bast said. We were downright frantic for a while.
One's down the tunnel.
Anything left for the stragglers?
They gave me free.
Graham asked as he sank onto his stool.
I know, but bloodhounds from that.
Before he could reply, a bull-shouldered man clattered an empty plate onto the bar and set a fork down gently beside it.
Last guy, there's a guy down
That,
there.
he said in a booming voice,
Oh, it's
was a
down there.
damn fine pie. A thin woman with a pinched face stood next to him. Don't you cuss, Elias, she said sharply. There's no call for that. Oh, honey, the big man said. Don't get yourself in a twit. Damn fine is a
Dude, we
kind
got
of
found
apple,
that one
innit?
time. That one time, that's all
He
it took.
grinned around at the folks sitting at the bar.
And having-
Sort of foreign apple from off an A-tour.
I mean, we did get.
They named it after Baron Damfine, if I remember correct.
Fun. That was the important part.
Graham grinned back at him. I think I heard that. The woman glared at all of them.
Yeah, I'm kind of.
I got these from the Bentons, the innkeeper said meekly. Oh, the big farmer said with a smile. That's my mistake, then. He picked up a crumb of crust from the plate and chewed it speculatively. I'd swear it was a damn fine pie for all that. Maybe the Bentons got them some damn fine apples and don't know it. His wife sniffed, then saw Chronicler sitting idle at his table and pulled her husband away. Old Cobb watched them go, shaking his head. I don't know what that woman needs in her life to make her a little happy, he said. But I hope she finds it before she pecks old Eli bloody. Jake and Graham made vague grumbles of agreement. Nice to see folks filling up the place. Old Cobb looked at the red-haired man behind the bar. You're a fine cook, Coat, and you've got the best beer in 20 miles. All folk need is a bit of an excuse to stop by. Old Cobb tapped the side of his nose speculatively. You know, he said to the innkeeper, you should bring in a singer or summit on nights. Hell, even the Orison boy can play a bit of his daddy's fiddle. I bet he'd be glad to come in for the price of a couple drinks. He looked around at the inn. A little music is just what this place needs. The innkeeper nodded. His expression was so easy and amiable, it almost wasn't an expression at all. I expect you're right, Coat said.
I was so
His
down
voice
with
was
this
perfectly calm.
until I saw my people.
It was a perfectly normal voice. It was colorless
Wait, hold up.
and clear as window glass.
You go front.
Yeah, I might
Old
go-
Cobb opened his mouth,
I'm gonna go.
but before
like,
he
right
could
here,
say
and then-
anything else, Bast rapped one knuckle hard on the bar. Drinks?
Yeah, this is winnable.
He asked the men sitting at the bar.
This is boys. Lock it in.
I'm guessing you'd all like a little something before we bring you out a bite to eat.
Or R9 Eva.
They did,
Raping each other.
and Bast bustled around behind the bar, pulling beer into mugs and pressing them into waiting hands.
To dad.
After a slow moment, the innkeeper swung silently into motion alongside his assistant, heading into the
We're not
kitchen to
fighting
fetch
each other,
soup,
by the way. We should
and bread
play
with
slow.
butter,
I cracked
and
you,
cheese,
dude.
and apples.
He cracked on me.
One dryer.
Chapter 47. Interlude. The Hempen Verse.
Use it.
Chronicler smiled as he made his way to the bar. That's a solid hour's work, he said proudly as he took a seat. I don't suppose
gonna
there's
come from
anything
behind, too.
left in the kitchen for me. Or any of that pie Eli mentioned, Jake asked hopefully. I want pie too, Bast said, sitting next to Jake, nursing a drink of his own.
Run that right. Run that right. Heal.
The innkeeper smiled, wiping his hands on his apron. I
fucking
think
out,
I
bro.
might
I'm
have
fucking out.
remembered to set one by, just in case you three came in later than the rest.
I'll do it. You
Old Cobb rubbed his hands together.
Shotzi had 58.
Can't remember the last time I had warm apple pie, he said.
Yo, you didn't see shit.
The innkeeper went back into the kitchen. He pulled the pie from the oven, sliced it, and laid the pieces neatly onto plates.
There's a guy
By the
right
time he
in front
carried
of you.
them out toward the tap room, he could hear raised voices in the other
No
room.
bullshit, though. There's a guy right here. Sean.
It was too a demon, Jake,
I'm looking at
Old
He's
Cobb
right
was
here.
saying angrily. I told you last night and I'll tell you again 100
fucking
times.
did.
I'm not a one to change my mind like other folk change their socks.
this shit.
He held up a finger.
Remember, watch out. Oh,
He called up a demon,
I told you.
and it bit this fellow and sucked out his juice like a plum.
don't even try.
I heard it from a fellow who knew a woman that's seen it herself.
Oh, no, he's
That's
killing
why the
Joe
constable and the deputies came and hauled him off. Meddling with dark forces is against the law over in Amory.
Just go pro.
I still say folk just thought it was a demon, Jake persisted. You know how
Oh, you
folk
know who's
are.
not different? Me.
I know folk, Old Cobb scowled. I've been around longer than you, Jacob, and I know my own story,
fuck?
too.
Okay. I'm better than
There was
that
a
guy,
long
that's
moment
all.
of tense silence at the bar before Jake
I'm
looked
fucking in
away.
here, bro.
I was just saying,
I want to play.
he muttered.
Wait, that guy just went
The innkeeper slid a bowl of soup toward
33.
Chronicler. What's this, then? The scribe gave the innkeeper a sly look. Cobb's telling us
He's
about
trapped.
Quoth's trial in Imre,
He's a
he
fucking
said,
demon.
a hint
The
of
armor's
smugness in
fucking-
his
this guy's
voice.
different, bro. This guy's fucking
Don't you
different.
remember? He started the story last night, but only made it halfway
Fucking
through.
different, bro.
Now! Cobb glared around as if daring them to interrupt. It was a tight
He's
spot.
different,
Quoth
dude.
knew if he was found guilty, they'd string him up and let him hang. Cobb made a gesture to one side of his neck like he was holding a noose, tilting his head to the side.
Oh, that's Timmy, brother.
But Quoth had read a great many books when he was at the university, and he knew himself a trick. Old Cobb stopped to take a forkful of pie and closed his eyes for a moment as he chewed. Oh, Lord and Lady, he said to himself.
Told you that shit
That's
was
a
broken.
proper pie. I swear it's better than me mam used to make. She always skint on the sugar.
Where they're going type shit?
He took another
and he
bite,
just
a
spat.
blissful expression spreading over his weathered face. So, Quoth knew a trick, Chronicler prompted. What? Oh! Cobb seemed to remember himself. Right. You see, there's 2 lines in the Book of the Path,
I'm not
and if you can
understanding.
read them out loud in the Old Tema only
That
priests
actually was
know,
to me, too.
then the Iron Law says you get treated like a priest. That means a Commonwealth judge can't do a damn thing to you. If you read those lines, your case has to be decided by the church
control
courts.
That is like
Old Cobb took another bite of pie and chewed it slowly before swallowing.
Oh my god.
Those 2 lines are called the Hempen Verse, because if you know them, you can keep yourself from getting strung up. The church courts can't hang a man, you see.
The thing that makes
What are the
wingman
lines?
so like broken
Bast
is the
asked.
strafe speed.
I dearly wish I
You strafe
knew,
really
Old
fast.
Cobb said mournfully,
It's
but I don't
like
speak Tema.
hip fire.
Quoth didn't know it himself, but he memorized the verse ahead of time.
Like move
Then
side with the
he
wingman
pretended
and
to
then take out
read it,
another gun
and the
like,
Commonwealth
like,
court had to let him
like
go.
an AR or something.
Quoth knew he had 2 days until a Talon justice could make it all the way to Amory, so he set about learning Tema. He read books and practiced for a whole day and a whole night,
Faster with the wingman.
and he was so powerful smart that at the end of his studying he could speak Tema better than most folk who had been doing it their whole lives. Then, on the second day before the justice showed up, Quoth mixed himself a potion. It was made out of honey, and a special stone you find in a snake's brain, and a plant that only grows at the bottom of the sea. When he drank the potion, it made his voice so sweet, anyone who listened couldn't help but agree with anything he said. So, when the justice finally showed up, the whole trial only took 15 minutes, Cobb said,
Be here in a
chuckling.
couple seconds.
Quoth gave a fine speech in perfect Tema. Everyone agreed with him, and they all went home.
They took
And he
the-
lived happily ever after,
I can
the red-haired
follow
man
in front
said
of them,
softly
but
from
I don't
behind
think
the
they
bar.
should.
shoot.
They don't know you're
Things
here.
were quiet at the bar. Outside, the air was dry and hot, full of dust and the smell of chaff. The sunlight was hard and bright as a bar of gold. Inside the Waystone, it was dim and cool. The men had just finished the last slow bites of their pie, and there was still a little beer in their mugs. So they sat for a little while longer, slouching at the bar with the guilty air of men too proud to be properly lazy.
It's not the worst.
I never much cared for Quoth stories myself, the innkeeper said matter-of-factly as he gathered up everyone's plates. Old Cobb
No,
looked
you
up
do.
from his beer.
You do.
That so?
Ready?
The innkeeper shrugged. If I'm going to have a story with magic, I'd like it to have a proper wizard in it. Someone like Taborlin the Great, or Serapha, or the Chronicler. At the end of the bar, the scribe didn't choke or startle. He did pause for half a second, though, before lowering his spoon back into his second bowl of soup. The room went comfortably quiet again as the innkeeper gathered up the last of the empty plates and turned toward the kitchen. But before he could get through the doorway,
This guy with the
Graham
charge
spoke
rifle's
up.
gotta get a firm
The
grip.
chronicler, he said. I haven't ever heard of him.
Looking at the moment.
The innkeeper turned back,
That's pretty
surprised.
far to be a free kill, but
You haven't? Graham shook his head.
Yo, Shotzi right here. Free
I'm
kill.
sure you have,
Shotzi right
the
here.
innkeeper
Free
said.
kill. All the way
He
back.
carries around a great book, and whatever he writes down in that book comes true.
I'm actually in my shit, no cap.
He looked at all of them
Oh, you
expectantly.
just spam it.
Jake shook his head too.
In here.
Yeah,
The
I'm fucking
innkeeper
here, too.
turned to the scribe
Go
at the
on,
end of the
go on,
bar,
go
who
on.
was keeping his attention on his food.
We miss sometimes.
You've heard of him, I'm sure, Coates said.
Nothing to do with it, but
They call him Lord of Stories,
It's worth
and
it.
if he learns one of your secrets,
His gun is
he can
definitely
write
worth
whatever
it.
he wants about you in his book.
You can like.
He looked
two-tap
at the
people
scribe.
on blue armor.
Haven't you ever heard of him?
Skull piercer?
Chronicler
Does
dropped his
99.
eyes and shook his
Or
head.
headshot.
He dipped the crust of his bread in his soup and ate it without speaking. The innkeeper looked surprised. When I was growing up, I liked the Chronicler more than Taberlin or any of the rest.
And it's pretty fucking.
He's got a bit of fairy blood in him, and it's made him sharper than a normal man.
It's good power.
He can see for 100 miles on a cloudy day and hear a whisper through a thick oak door. He can track a mouse through a forest on a moonless night.
Okay. You know him.
I've heard of him, Bass said eagerly. His sword is named Sheev, and the blade is made of a single piece of paper. It's light as a feather, but so sharp that if he cuts you, you see the blood before you even feel it.
Where am I scanning them?
The innkeeper nodded. And if he learns your name, he can write it on the blade of the sword and use it to kill you from 1,000 miles away.
Oh, you're dead.
But he's got to write it in his own blood, Bast added.
They're up here with me.
And there's only so much space on the sword. He's already written 17 names on it, so there's not that much room left.
I gotta go here.
He used to be a member of the High King's court in Modeg, Coates said. But he fell in love with the High King's daughter.
They're like on you already.
Graham and Old Cobb were nodding now. This was familiar territory.
I got hit.
Coat continued. When Chronicler asked to marry her, the High King was angry, so he gave Chronicler a task to prove he was worthy.
I'm getting a drop.
The innkeeper paused dramatically.
I missed.
Yo, I gotta be ass for this thing, dude.
Dude, no. That guy's invincible. Q.
On you. Focus that idiot.
Dude. Hello? Am I just the worst player?